Hi, we're back again to finish up the installation of the Baker DD7 transmission. In the first video, there were a couple of steps that we left off. In typical Baker fashion, they've made more improvements to the DD7, and we're pretty excited about that. So in this video, we will complete the disassembly because of the new steps in this video. Then we'll get on to the installation of the DD7. So appreciate you watching. Let's get started. Complete the disassembly, we're going to remove the shift lever mechanism and the shifter pawl. You'll notice on the shifter shaft mechanism you'll have a small snap ring. A pair of .038 snap ring pliers works great to remove that. We'll remove the washer and then slide the assembly out. To remove the shift lever and mechanism assembly, you'll have to rotate it down to the inside of the transmission. Then you can remove it from the opposite side and set that aside. The DD7 kit also comes with a new shifter shaft seal. So you want to make sure to remove the seal. It's fairly easy to remove. I use a seal puller. You can actually use a small screwdriver inside there because it's not pressed in there very hard. You want to be very careful since the seal is so narrow. Be careful not to mar the inside of the surface on the engine case. So always use a rag as well if you're using a seal puller so you don't damage the outer edge of the case. Pulls out fairly easily. And the last step for disassembly, you'll need to access the vehicle speed sensor, which is located underneath the starter. Sometimes you can just pull the starter to the side, but because of your battery cable connected to the top of the starter, you have to be very careful with that. We'd actually recommend just disconnecting the battery to avoid shorting it out. Okay. Once you remove the vehicle speed sensor, you'll see it has an O-ring. You want to maintain the O-ring and add the spacer gasket that's included with the kit. Then slide the sensor back in place. I like to use a small amount of oil on the seal when reinstalling it. As with any fastener, I want to recommend that you install to the proper torque settings. You can refer to the Baker instructions or to the factory service manual. Once you have that torqued back down, we can reinstall the harness and replace the starter. Before we begin the installation, I'll do an unbox here and show you everything that's included. First off, you have all of your necessary gaskets and seals, a new main bearing retainer clip, 12-point ARP stainless steel fasteners, inner primary bearing race, of course your main bearing, and the transmission. You'll notice that the shift drum is zip tied with the shafts and the forks already assembled and in place. That makes the installation quite a bit easier. The other reason I wanted to show you this is to do a comparison between the Baker transmission and the stock transmission. Some of the things to point out would be Baker has a billet aluminum door that's been machined versus the cast on the stock. You can also notice the width of the gears, quite a bit of difference. They also have a billet machined shift drum instead of cast like on the stock. The other differences would be the angles in the shift drum and also the shifter pawl assembly and the angles there. That's the key difference in making this thing shift so much better than the stock transmission. And of course the gears, how they're manufactured, and just the physical size of the gears alone makes it a much stronger and better transmission. There we go. And for the first step of the installation, we're going to install the shifter shaft seal. You want to make sure you obviously orient it correctly. And we'll start by just barely sliding the seal into place, and then use a proper drive tool to set the depth and get the seal in straight. And once the seal is fully seated, we're going to install the shifter shaft assembly. Now you'll notice I've wrapped a small amount of electrical tape around it to prevent the splines from damaging the seal. One other tip, you want to make sure to use a little bit of assembly lube on the shaft to help it ease through the seal a little bit better. And you'll notice my oil can here, proudly made in the U.S. and purchased in the 1930s by my grandfather. So every time I use this, I take a bit of pride in the U.S. made products that have lasted and stood the test of time. So we're going to start passing it through the transmission from this direction with the assembly facing upside down, and you'll be able to slide it up through and work it into the seal. And then turn the assembly back upright. You'll also notice the two forks on the spring and then there's a pin on the opposite side of this bolt. The two forks on the spring center over the top of that bolt and slide into place. And once you have it fully seated, with a pair of pliers you can grab your electrical tape and it should slide off fairly easily. Unwrap it. Then you'll replace your washer. And the snap ring. Once it's fully seated, you can return the shift pawl assembly to the top of the transmission, as we did during disassembly, to get it out of the way of the gear set. And reinstall your shift lever. Now we'll install the main bearing. First thing I like to do before installation is a little assembly lube inside the bearing. Rotate that around a bit. Make sure we have it seated in there. For the outside of the bearing, I like to use a little bit of press fit lube to prevent galling the transmission case. So that a bit. You can see I've already installed the puller on the opposite side. Need the adapter for the bearing. And again, I'll use these spacers so I don't have to thread it on quite as far. And we'll pull the bearing into place. It should be fairly simple to install. If you run into any resistance, then you'll want to pull the assembly back apart in case you've galled the aluminum in the transmission case during disassembly. And once you have the bearing seated completely, you can look on the inside and see the groove that the snap ring will be installed in. Then we're going to install the snap ring and move to the other side to install the gear set. And now we're back over here to the transmission assembly. When Baker ships the transmission, the main drive gear is already installed on the transmission. So we need to remove the main drive gear and then press it into the main drive gear bearing that we just installed in the transmission case. Now you also notice the seal has already been installed. So we want to make sure that in order to prevent damaging the seal, that we wrap some electrical tape around the splines on the main shaft to avoid damaging that particular seal. And after you do that, the main drive gear will just slide right off. Now we're going to go install this into the bearing. Now we're going to be installing the main drive gear. You'll notice the seal. Again, we want to make sure use a little bit of assembly lube to prevent pinching the seal. And the gear is installed from the opposite side of the transmission through the case. So I'm going to go on that side and install the pullers, get this into place, and show you how we pull it in. Now we've slid the main drive gear in through the main drive gear bearing from the opposite side of the transmission. We've got our puller in place. Install the spacer, And another spacer so I don't have to turn the screws so far. Washer, bearing, washer. Nut on the puller. And again, this doesn't require very much force. If it does, then you need to stop and back up. You may have the main drive gear in at a cant into the bearing. Now we're back on the right hand side of the motorcycle. We have put a little bit of lube on the seal inside the main drive gear on the left hand side. We've also kept the electrical tape around the splines on the main shaft to keep from damaging that particular seal. And we've also put a little bit of oil on the main shaft and on that electrical tape to help it slide in easier. We've cleaned the gasket surfaces and installed the trapdoor gasket on the transmission. Now, one thing you'll notice, you've got multiple bearing surfaces and shafts that have to line up on the inside of the transmission. Once we start it in, we'll be able to move and wiggle these a bit to get everything to line up. And again, you'll notice I already have the gasket into place. Carefully slide it into the main shaft, into the main gear. You'll also notice I've cut the zip tie off. Got all the shafts seated, gaskets aligned properly with the dowels, and we can slide it completely into place. And now I'll get all the ARP fasteners that are included with the kit and torque the trap door down to specifications. Now that we have all the fasteners installed just to seat the transmission, you want to make sure that you follow the torque specifications and sequence that's included with the instructions on the Baker transmission. You should always use Loctite, but especially on stainless steel fasteners. Loctite helps to lubricate the threads and prevent the stainless steel from galling the aluminum. So once you've verified your torque specs all the way around, then you're good to reinstall the clutch push rod that we had removed earlier and reinstall your throwout bearing assembly. Install your side cover gasket, and you'll notice there are locating pins on the trap door to hold that in place. And then we're going to install the side cover. And installing the side cover, of course, you want to make sure you follow the factory torque sequence and also torque specifications as found in the DD7 instructions. Again, of course, make sure that you've used blue Loctite. Now we can install the main drive gear seal. First, you can remove the electrical tape that we had put on the splines. I like to pre-lube the seal and the sealing surface inside the main drive gear bearing before installation. Help it slide in there a bit easier. And of course, always make sure you have the seal oriented in the proper direction. You can carefully walk the seal into place to just get it started inside the transmission case, and then use a proper installation tool to seat the seal at its proper depth and straight. Before we install the top cover on the transmission, I want to make sure to pull the shifter pawl assembly back, put it back into its stock location and down. Then we'll install the top cover gasket supplied in the DD7 kit, along with the factory top cover. Okay, other than reinstalling the inner primary bearing race onto the main shaft of the transmission, the front belt pulley, and everything in reverse order, you removed it. Your inner primary clutch basket, chain, compensator, etc. And you want to drop 32 ounces of fluid into the transmission, of course. Personally, I prefer an 80W90 gear oil for the smoothest operation. Now, twice a year here at Pro Twin Performance, we have a Baker Blowout in the spring and in the fall. So if you're interested in a DD7 transmission from Baker Drivetrain or any other of their transmissions, be sure to give me a call to tell you more about the specials. Now, be sure, hit the thumbs up if you like the video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with your friends. We appreciate you watching.